Welcome back, everyone. Nice to see you guys again, and thank you for rolling with the last-minute postponement. It is great to be back. It is great to be learning with you all. And Sue, I don't mean to be weird, but all week since we canceled last week, I've been looking forward to having you read out loud to me again.
I appreciate it. Thank you. We missed you last week.
Thank you. So I'm gonna bring us back up to speed a little bit because it's been 2 weeks. And then today we're gonna read Ezra 9, an example of a penitential prayer. So what we've done so far in this class is we've read Lamentations 2 and we've read Psalm 88. And both of those have been examples of lament. We've seen both of those as examples of what it means to be hurting, what it means to be broken, and crying out to God from this place of need, right? Both of those, Psalm 88 and also Lamentations 2, raised questions of, God, why did you do this to me? God, how could this have happened to me? God, something is wrong, and you are the only one who can fix it because you are the one who caused it. Lamentations 2 and Psalm 88 were different, though, because Lamentations 2 we saw how it was dialogic. It had a couple different voices speaking, 2 different voices speaking, and it's had the figure of Jerusalem. She seemed to be embodying, or she seemed to be representing an entire community. Psalm 88 we read as deeply individual, right? This is one person's cry for help.
Nothing makes a difference. No, don't. It doesn't make any difference.
Ezra 9, we're going back to the idea of a community prayer. We're reading one man's prayer on behalf of his entire community. And the way it's going to work, the way it's going to sound, what he's trying to accomplish is very, very different from what we've seen in the 2 laments we've read. Rather than saying, God, you did this, God, you need to fix it, it's a prayer where he says, God, we've done this horrible thing. You're really great. And there's almost like he doesn't even quite say, hey, God, can you make it better? He leaves that moment, that thought almost unsaid, because he is so humble before God. He is so respectful of God's power that he's not even going to go so far as to really ask God for anything. So sounds a lot different than Psalm 88, sounds a lot different than Lamentations 2. And in some ways sounds much more similar to prayer today. Prayer where it's, God, you're great in these ways, God, you've been great to our ancestors, we're big fans. As we read Ezra 9 today, we're going to think about why that sort of prayer may have developed, why it might be used in this situation in Ezra 9, and why it might be the way we pray in communal settings more or less today. Okay, so I've jumped you guys all the way to the Book of Ezra. Can anyone catch us up, give us a little background on what we're doing in the Book of Ezra? What is this book? It's this, book all the way at the end of the Tanakh, at the end of the Bible. It's a good name. I feel like everyone I know is naming their child Ezra. Any of you guys know just anything about this Ezra guy, about this book named after Ezra?
It has to do with the temple.
Has to do with the temple? Great. Yeah. Can I pull any more out of you on that? All right. So we've got the Book of Ezra has something to do with the temple. So I'll give you a little bit of historical background. So the Book of Ezra is what's called a post-exilic book, which means what it sounds like. It's written post-exile. It's written as we come back into the land. So if the Book of Lamentations was written as a response to the destruction of the temple and the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of Judah, and then we were in exile for 70 years. After 70 years of exile, guy, king of Persia, emperor of Persia, named Cyrus the Great, or the way we call it in Hebrew, Koresh, issues an edict which allows the Jews back into the land of Israel. And according to the Tanakh, he says, you should go build your temple. And so the Jews start to come back to Israel to build their temple. For those of you who are noting subtle differences in language, you might have noticed that before, when we talked about Psalm 88, when we talked about Lamentation 2, we've been calling these people the Israelites. Now, as we come back from exile, it's fair to call us the Jews for the first time, because one of the big things that happens as we come back from exile is we no longer really have a tribal identity. We're aware of our ancestors, we're aware of our tribal affiliations, and we try to maintain some sort of connection to the tribes that were, but we're coming back as a collective, we're coming back as the Jews from exile, we're coming back into a land that is sort of ours to rebuild. And we have to figure out what it means for us to be a nation, what it means for us to be in relationship with God, what it means for us, how we define who we are. Because even though we've come back into the land, we're not officially ruling the land. We are still a province under Persian authority. So incredibly interesting book. It's a book that's studied extensively in Israel today as a parallel to what it meant for us to come back into the land of Israel in the late 1800s, early 1900s, what it means to come back into a place that was once yours and to try and form a new national identity based on your old historical and ethnic roots. So Bob, all right. So that's big background to Book of Ezra. Specific background on this chapter that we're about to read together is Ezra is a priest. He is likely the high priest. He comes from a long line of high priests. He was in exile and has led a group of people back. He was not among the very first people to come back from exile, but he does come back from exile. And he gets there and he's engaging in a couple of projects. And then we get to Ezra 9. People are going to come to Ezra in this chapter and tell him some information. He's going to try and process it. And then he's going to perform this prayer. So, well, we're about to read it. Before we do that, any questions, thoughts, ideas up to this point? Yeah.
Was Ezra the one who instituted reading the Torah in the market?
Yes, great. Oh, I knew you guys knew that. I was waiting for someone to say it. Darlene was right with the temple, but it's also the thing you're most likely to know him for, and this actually happens in the book of Nehemiah, if you're speaking English, is he institutes the annual reading out loud of the Torah in the marketplace. Thank you, Susan. Sorry, Sue. Other questions, ideas before we start? All right. And by start, I mean, Sue, can I pass the mic to you? And will you read us the verses 1 to 5?
Okay. When these things were done, the leaders approached me saying, the people of Israel and the Kohanes and the Levites have not separated from the peoples of the lands, just like their abominations of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, the Ammonites, the Moabites, and Egyptians, and the Amorites. Because they have married some of their daughters to them and to their sons, and they have mixed the holy seed with the peoples of the lands. And the hand of the officers and the officials has been most mixed up in this. And when I heard this thing, I tore my clothes and my robe, and I pulled hair out of my head and my beard, and I sat desolate. And to me gathered all those who tremble at the words of the Elohim of Israel on account of the trespass of the exile. And I sat desolate until the evening mincha sacrifice. And at the evening mincha sacrifice, I got up from my fast, and tearing my clothes and my robe, and I sank down upon my knees, and I spread my palms to God, my Elohim.
Thank you, Sue. All right. So what's the issue at stake here? What's the problem? What's causing Ezra to go through these mourning rituals?
Sounds like he's against intermarriage.
Yeah. Right. So thank you, Daniel. People come up to him and they're like, hey, there's intermarriage happening. And he's like, oh, I've seen Fiddler on the Roof. I'm gonna start tearing my clothes here. It's interesting because—
I'm glad you interpreted my comment correctly.
It's wonderful to be on the same page. All right, so up to this point, do we know what attitudes towards intermarriage have been in the Tanakh?
Well, I think that the first one comes to my mind. I'm actually reading Pinchas, which doesn't happen for a couple of weeks, but I'm writing something on it. And it's not just that you're having sex or marrying people from other people, but it's kind of like dancing, you also take in their gods, and the two are almost synonymous, at least in what I'm reading about Pinchas. So anyway, I suspect that it's not. I don't think we can read a racial or ethnic prejudice here. I think that it's, by definition, the men are, or the women are, I guess, somehow taking the religion of these tribes, and that's what upsets me. That's my guess.
Great, thank you, Daniel. Yeah, so that in other places before this in the Tanakh, especially in the story of Pinchas, there's been an awareness that you shouldn't marry other people from other religions because there's some association. If you marry them, maybe you'll take their gods. And I mentioned this in the introduction to Lamentations in our very first class, but that was a while ago, that we use this like marriage metaphor, right, of Israel whoring after other gods. This idea that there's something like it's as if Israel's trying to marry Israel, the personified collective nation, is trying to marry the other gods, rather than being true in her marriage to the one true God. However, we see a different attitude towards intermarriage in the Tanakh as well. Martin, Debbie, do you have something to add?
Yeah, so I'm looking at number 2, and it seems to say that you've married their daughters to them and to their sons. And in the way things worked in those days, if your daughters married him, you lost them completely, right? They became part of that other tribe.
Yeah. So, yes. Is there another little bit to that thought?
Well, the point is, it's a big deal then. If your daughters are marrying out, then you're losing population, right? It's not like you're bringing them in when you intermarry, you're losing.
Great. So, which is interesting because then it's clear from that why we might object to our daughters marrying their sons. It's not clear why we would object to our sons marrying their daughters. Right? Like if the problem is losing people, we'd only care about losing daughters to them. We wouldn't care about gaining daughters from them. Sue.
The other thing is that it's not just the people are doing this. This is going up to the highest levels. It's the leaders who are doing this, and it's the Kohanim and the Levites as well. They're all involved in this.
Great, and that yes, and that there's something we know there are very strict laws about who the Kohanim can marry and who they really ought not marry. And that also is sort of connected to the story of Pinchas as Daniel is bringing up. Great. So it's interesting who approaches Ezra to tell him this, right? It's the leaders, the Salim, which is in itself it's a derived from an Aramaic word, so anyway. So it's these sort of unidentified people are coming to Ezra, being like, everyone's doing this, including the Kohanim, including the Levites. And Ezra himself is a Kohen, so like it's not just the normal people, it's your people, oh Ezra, are doing this, right? Just one sec before I lose it, with the intermarriage question I asked you before, even though we had clear examples like Pinchas and like some of like the Jezebel story, which are anti-intermarriage, we also have clear examples that intermarriage is okay earlier in the Tanakh. Famously, Moses doesn't marry an Israelite woman. There's plenty of other examples where people marry outside of the Israelites and it is okay. So what's happening here is it's for the first time, we are really, really taking a firm stand on intermarriage being absolutely evil. Daniel?
Just briefly, the sentence opened the paragraph when these things were done. What were the things that were done?
Great, thanks for asking. So the chapter 8 describes Ezra and his band of people coming back to the land, and then they get back to Jerusalem and they offer a bunch of sacrifices to celebrate having returned to Jerusalem. And so like if they've been there for 2 minutes, they've been there for not very long, and this is more detail than we need to get into, but Ezra is coming back like at this moment from exile. There've been a group of people who came back earlier from exile, and there's been a group of people who never got sent to exile, the nation of the people of the land, Am Haaretz. So part of what's going on here is figuring out, okay, how do we make the in-group, who's the leader of these combining forces, and how do we unite despite our differences, the differences between when we arrived, the differences between what we've been doing for the past 100 years in Babylon or in Judah. And so the leaders who are approaching him here are presumably the leaders of those who have already been in the land for a second now. Daniel?
So, do I still have my hand up? Well, I'll go ahead and ask a question since you said my name. Basically, what I heard you say is that in the biblical era, like Ruth converted by saying, "I'm gonna be a Jew. I'm gonna have your land, your God, and your people." Here, that doesn't seem to even be in the picture that people convert to Judaism or to whatever you called it at the time. Is that where you were going?
Great. So at this point, Ezra is not going to mention conversion. It's not part of the picture. It's if you're intermarrying is bad. There's no process to convert that Ezra is bringing up, and that brings us to this particular word he uses, holy seed, Zerah HaKodesh, right? So that there's the reason we shouldn't intermarry is because it's diluting, it's intermingling the holy seed which we bear, which we carry. This is one of the first times that we're talking about like Judaism flows through the blood, that what it means to be one of us is that it's passed down through genetics, through the holy seed, if you will. It's also interesting as a choice of words because there's a lot about us coming back and how we plant ourselves in the land. And here it's this like cool, interesting metaphor. Like we are the holy seed. We, the Jews, are the holy seed, and we are planting ourselves in the land and will be fruitful and multiply. Okay, this is incredibly interesting, and I wish I could teach you guys for 3 hours, but we haven't even gotten to the prayer yet, which is what we've come to do. So
Sorry.
yeah, wonderful. So just quickly moving on to verses 3 to 5, which Sue already read for us. I said that these look like mourning rituals. What is Ezra doing? Like, why act as if he's mourning? And I think Daniel, that's why you and I both made that fiddler on the roof connotation, right? It's almost like he's sitting shiva for a kid or for the wrong in the nation. Other ideas on why this looks like mourning, what he's doing, what's happening in verses 3 to 5, what stands out? Yeah, Sue.
I failed as a Kohen to prevent this from happening. I failed as an officer of the temple to keep everything good from this. It's a failing of mine, and I have to do penance for that.
Okay, wow, and that's I love that, because it's like, it's my failing, and it's my failing as a Kohen, so therefore necessarily I'm going to rip up my Kohenic clothes, right? I'm not fit to be wearing these things. I'm not fit to represent this office almost. Cool. Other thoughts, ideas?
So these also resemble rites of mourning, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so these resemble rites of mourning, and it's unclear exactly for whom he is mourning at this point. And we'll keep that as a question as we continue to read the text, as we read his prayer he's about to launch into. Why is he engaging in rituals of mourning, rites of mourning? What or whom is he mourning for? One interesting word here, I don't remember if we have Hebrew speakers in this class. Oh, hello. Martin, would you read the very first line of verse 4?
Verse 4.
Yeah.
Ve'elah ye'asfu kol chared b'divrei Elohei Yisrael al ma'al hagolah v'ani yoshev mishomem ad leminchat ha'arev.
Great, thank you, beautiful. Love the way you pronounce your eyes.
Yeah, a little bit.
So in that we have the word chared, right? Which I translated as tremble, is in fact how you translate that word. And this idea of all who tremble gathered to Ezra. Just interesting today in our context. You all know the word tremble, you all know the word chared, because it's the root that forms today's, for 10 points. Martin knows he doesn't get to say. Anybody else know? All right, Martin, tell us.
The Haredi group within Judaism, which are the people who view themselves as trembling before God.
Yeah, the Haredim, if you say it without the beautiful Hebrew accent, the Haredis. Yeah, so this is that root of those who tremble before God, those who are worrying about God's law, those who are most concerned with following the letter of the law. All right. Also, one point I want to make here before we get to the actual prayer, the actual meat of this thing. Everything Ezra is doing here right now, he's doing with awareness, and we can read his awareness that he has just come into this land, and he is in some ways performative. He is making gestures that can be read. He's enacting symbols that will be understandable to a greater audience. So that audience is all who tremble before God. That audience is these leaders who come to him. it's a question, are these leaders who came to him in verse 1, have they now, when they saw Ezra's gestures, did they become those who tremble before God? Did they become transformed already by Ezra's gestures before he even spoke to become those who tremble before God? All right, so we'll now read his prayer by William and Sue, if that's all right. Just before you do, as we read his prayer, we're going to keep two questions in mind for now. One, for what is he mourning? For whom is he mourning? And two, for whom is he saying this prayer? Who's hearing him? What is he trying to accomplish here? Is he in conversation with God? Is he in conversation with the people? What's the driving thing here? Daniel, you had a question? Oh, you're still mute.
I hesitate I don't want to take you off track, but the trespass of the exile, can you briefly describe what trespass does not seem accurate to me? They didn't trespass against anybody when they got kicked out of the land.
Not according to Jeremiah.
It is a great question. You can translate the word in a couple of ways because of the wrongdoing is another way to translate it. We're gonna move on. Sue, will you take us away, and let's just do that very first box, verses 6 and 7.
And I said, my Elohim, I am ashamed and humiliated to raise my face to you, my Elohim, because our sins have risen higher than our head, and our guilt has grown to the heavens. From the days of our fathers to this very day, we have been very guilty, and for our sins, we have given our kings and Kohanes into the hands of the kings of the lands by sword and in captivity, and as plunder and in shamefacedness until this very day.
Great, thank you. All right. What's he doing here? What's he saying? What's he trying to accomplish? What stands out in this verse?
Well, first he's acknowledging that he and others are at fault for what the desperate situation they find themselves in. So he's being humble, at least.
Great, yeah, and yes, and I love it's he and others, right? He starts out with the me, the I. My Elohim, I am ashamed to raise and humiliated to raise my face to you, my Elohim. And then once he's done that, like first second of individual penitence, he can talk about our guilt and our responsibility here, our head, our guilt, which works nicely when we think about like what a Kohen does, right? That a Kohen makes individual penitence before he can make penitence for the people. Okay. Other things we notice about these verses, other thoughts? What's he doing? Why might he bring the days of our fathers in? What might that be referring to?
It sounds to me like he's saying that the Jews didn't behave, which is why they got kicked out of the land, which is not. Is that the way they thought about it? He says that they did sins, and that's why they're in Persia.
Okay.
Isn't that what he's saying? Am I totally misunderstanding this?
No, you are right on, right? So that there's from the days of our fathers, and you could interpret that right, that me from the days of our fathers, you could translate that like our forefathers, our ancestors, like we have been eternally guilty before you. Or you could interpret that like literally our fathers or our grandfathers were bad, they got kicked out of the land, we went into exile, and now that we're back in the land, we are continuing their sin. we are doing wrong just as they did wrong, and we should know better, because just as they were exiled, surely wouldn't we also be exiled? Great. Okay. It's interesting. It's really interesting phrase. Our sins have risen higher than our head, and our guilt has grown to the heavens. Does that any connotations there? What might it mean? Why might he talk like that? we got blankness. I don't know. He's a poetic guy. What can we do?
We're
Mark?
underwater.
They're underwater.
Yes, our sins have risen higher than our heads.
It's beautiful, and especially with that, like there's like sounds almost like Psalm 88, right? Like we are drowning in our own sins.
Although honestly, I was also thinking about this gigantic garbage heap that used to be next to Kvish Geha in Israel. It was they finally stopped dumping garbage on it when the airplanes were having trouble taking off from Ben Gurion, but it was just like this thing you always saw, bigger than any other hill. So also a garbage dump.
Right. So we don't need to be, it's what it means to drown in our sins, for our sins to be higher than our head. It doesn't need to be water we're drowning in. It's like each sin is a rotten apple, is a crippled,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
I was thinking of being buried, like you're underneath the ground.
Great. Oh, that's a horrible. I think if I had to choose between being buried and like being under garbage of my own sins, or being literally buried by my own sins, I might prefer the garbage metaphor. But that's, wow, Sue.
How can we reach you, God, if we have to kind of slog our way up through all of these other things from this in order to be able to extend our hand to you and you your hand to us?
Great. Yes. There's this idea, right, that our guilt has grown to the heavens rather than like our cry for help or our plea or whatever. Like the thing reaching the heavens isn't pure and isn't good. Rather, it's this garbage we've created. It's the sin we've put forth into the earth. Great. Yeah. And it's almost reminiscent of like Tower of Babel, that there's something almost hubristic about having built up all these sins as a way of reaching God. Great. All right. So, and then the last thing about our sins higher than our head, or guilt is grown to the heavens, is Ezra's body position at this point is low, right? He tore out the hair out of his head, and now he's prostrating himself. He's sunk down on his knees. So it's as if he's saying, okay, we had this highfalutin notion of ourselves. We were putting ourselves up. We were raising our heads, raising our guilt towards the heaven, and now I've fallen to my knees. It's like I'm trying to. There was sin stuck on the top of my head, and I'm trying to knock it off. All right. Also interesting, so he's talking here in this first person plural voice, this our voice. What group is he trying to represent? Who's included, who's not included? We talked about the central issue here is defining the Jewish people, who's in and who's out. All right, we'll keep reading and keep that as a question. It's interesting because it seems like the kings and the Kohanes are not included as the first person plural, right? That we, the common people, we, maybe the small leaders gave the big leaders into their hands, but it's not their fault, it's our fault. It is us, it is you, Joe Schmo, and me, Michael Henry, that we did this together. And it's not, we can't blame our leaders for having done this. Rather, we can blame ourselves. We can hold ourselves accountable. All right. Sue, would you read 8 and 9 for us?
And now just a moment after there has been grace from God, our Elohim, to leave us survivors and to give us a peg in his holy place, to light our eyes, O our Elohim, and to give us a little revival in our slavery. For we are slaves, and in our slavery, our Elohim did not forsake us. And he extended to us mercy before the kings of Persia, giving us a revival to raise up the temple of our Elohim and to stand its ruins up and to give us a wall around Judah and Jerusalem.
Great. All right. I'm going to talk about these two verses for a sec because we've got not the most time left. Some things that are interesting in this verse. We start with the word va'ata, and now, which is a word that you're going to find over and over again in penitential prayer. It's okay. I've described something, and now I'm switching topics. The topic switch we see here is if before Ezra was describing, we're very, very guilty, everything sucks because we're horrible. Now he's describing God and God's goodness in verse 8. And in verse 9, he's describing the people's mission. And when we think about Ezra here and who he might be talking to, what the audience might be, who the audience might be, interesting that in verse 9, he's like, all right, so we are guilty of this sin, presumably intermarrying is the sin, this is the bad thing we did. And really, the thing we were supposed to do, the reason we're here is to build a temple, to raise up the ruins, and to build a wall around Jerusalem and Judah. That we have a specific mission. Everything else is stuff we are wasting our time with. We are busy marrying with the people of the land, with the daughters of the not Jews, rather than focusing on the thing at hand. Hey guys, maybe you should be building the temple. Maybe you should be building the wall to keep our cities straight or safe, because as you'll remember, it wasn't very long ago that we were in exile. That the way he's talking to God here is almost, or talking about God here is almost like God's really powerful and he just punished us and maybe he'll do it again if we don't do what we're supposed to do here. We came with a mission. Thoughts about 8 and 9? All right, yeah.
You've given us a second chance and it looks like we've blown it already.
Yeah, Beth. Yeah, and there's something like really very sad about that, right? Like Ezra just came all the way from Persia. Not an easy journey, it's not something even today, it's not an easy journey. There's a large desert in between Jerusalem and Persia. He's just come all the way to Judah, Jerusalem, and now his people are already screwing it up. I might as well not unpack my bags because maybe we're going back into exile. Okay. All right. Other thoughts about these two verses? All right, Sue, will you take us away with 10 and 11?
And now what can we say, O our God, after this, because we have forsaken your commandments, which you commanded us in the hand of your servants, the prophets, saying, the land that you are coming to possess is an unclean land. It is in the uncleanliness of the peoples of the lands with their abominations that have filled it from one mouth to another with their impurities.
Great. Okay. So, word here that repeats is this uncleanliness word. Can one of my Hebrew speakers, what is that word in Hebrew?
Well, midah.
Great. Tell
It's ritual uncleanness, right? It's not physical dirt, it's ritual and tum'ah.
Great.
Toeva.
So
It's toeva. Those are the words.
great. Yeah. So what are the normal connotations? Where do we normally see words like those?
With regard to sexual impurity and so forth, well, toeva is used in Leviticus to describe what homosexuals do.
Tumai.
Nida is the state of a woman who's menstrually unclean and not available to her husband. And tumai is used in lots of contexts to say something that's not clean enough for whatever activity.
Great. Yeah. So why might why might he be using these sexually tinged words here?
Because of the intermarriage.
Say again?
Because of the intermarriage
Okay.
and the abominations. And the mouth part seems to me to mean that there's prayer going on, or there's some kind of speaking to other gods going on.
Great. They've filled it from one mouth to another, right? It's striking imagery how it works. I mean, it works both on a sort of nasty sexual level, spreading around the filth, and also on a like spreading around the idolatry, the worship of other gods from mouth to mouth to mouth. Daniel, you look perturbed.
I'm gonna listen here for a minute.
Okay.
I'm trying to follow.
Okay. So one thing too about this uncleanliness, the unclean land, the word nida is, as Martin pointed out, it's a word that's used for ritual impurity. It's often a word that's used to describe when a woman has been menstruating and then needs to remove remove the impurity gained because she's been menstruating. The original, the root of this word, the place from which this word, the idea of menstruating comes, is that nida originally means like expulsion, elimination, pushing something out, which sort of gives a double meaning here, right? The land that you're coming to possess is an unclean land, or is a land of expulsion, is a land of pushing out. That this is the land that will push out uncleanliness. That here we are trying to plant the holy seed in this land, and this land is the land that's been defiled. This land is a land of impurity. This is the land that expels impurity. And that's a concept you see repeatedly in the Torah and in the prophetic books, right? This is a land that's going to vomit out people. This is a land that cannot sustain wrongs done against it. So here, the land itself is already an unclean land. It's already filled with wrongness. It's as if, okay, we got expelled, we got exiled, rather, 70 years ago, 100 years ago. But the land is still suffering. The land is still full of all the wrongdoings of all the other people. And coming back, it's not like we're coming back to a clean slate. It's not like we're coming back to a land that is ready to start over with us from ground zero. It's not like we get to build a relationship with the land and with God from nothing. Rather, we have to be perfect. We have to be the best of the best, so that this volatile land, this abused land, this land that has suffered so much, doesn't do what it's naturally inclined to do and exile us and vomit us out and expel us again. All right. So moving on to the big denouement here. Sue, would you read us next box?
And now do not give your daughters to their sons, and do not take their daughters for your sons, and do not seek their peace or their well-being ever, so that you may be strong and eat of the land and leave it as a possession for your sons forever.
Great. Okay, we can stop there. How did we get there? Why? I talked about we have a structure, right? When we say "and now," it's a topic switch. It's a new method of argument. How did we get from the beginning of Ezra's prayer to this "and now don't go marrying their people"? What's the structure of his argument? We started out in verse 6 and 7 saying, I'm ashamed, we're guilty, we're very, very guilty. Verse 8 and 9, we came here for a purpose. Verse 10 and 11, we have forsaken your commandments and we don't belong in this land, right? We're not ready to be in this land. This land has specific requirements that we are not fulfilling. So we get to verse 12, where for the first time, Ezra is able to say, I've made the argument, I've explained to you what happens when you don't treat the land correctly, when you don't follow God's commands. And this is it. I've made that argument, and the thing you should do now and the action you should take is not do intermarriage. That it's been this whole long diatribe to get to this point in verse 12, don't intermarry. Don't do it, bad. Land will expel you, God will exile you, not worth doing. Of course, it's interesting because until verse 12, the person or the group that Ezra has been addressing, the vocative, the you here, has been God, right? Oh Elohim, oh God, so on and so forth. And now in verse 12, the you here is a you all, and it's the people of Israel, or the people who are assembled in front of him. How do you make sense of that? Why? How does he switch from talking to God to talking to the people? Why might he switch from talking to God to talking to the people? Is this in verse 12 functioning as prayer? Is this part of his prayer to God? How might this be working as prayer? He's been talking to God. Oh God this, oh God that, God this, God that, God. All of a sudden, you people don't give your daughters, don't give your sons. How do we get to that switch?
I guess he's saying that unless the people shape up, it's no good praying to God. We've got to get our act together, otherwise God's not going to hear us.
Wow, you bet. Okay.
Well, it's also the whole performative bit of mourning and then going to the sacrifice, to the site of the evening sacrifice, and demonstratively and performatively mourning in front of everybody. He's making a point. First he talks to God, and then he breaks the fourth wall and talks to his audience. And so this is the moral of the story.
Great. Yes. Oh, amazing. So that there's something like this whole prayer, this whole speaking to God that he's been doing up to this point. What you're arguing, Debbie, is that the point hadn't been for God to listen and God to change or God to do anything. The point had been for the people to hear the story he was telling and hear that he's in communication with God, so that then when he tells the people to change their actions, they're like, oh, we'd better do this. Big, powerful guy, very compelling story. Let's listen.
And there's also this sense of, he says, this very day, Hayom Hazeh, Hayom Hazeh. This is sort of, we're on the brink here. This is our encounter with our purpose. We came back. We're supposed to build the temple. We are at a point of choice about whether we can go forward and redeem the land.
Is there any sense here to anyone that okay, when you were in Persia and you intermarried, you were in Persia. So, somehow or another that's wasn't a good thing to do, but God and I understand why you did it. But here, this is Israel. And these people, the intermarriage thing is just not an option. You have to, I think maybe this is what Marty was saying. I'm not sure. But it's either, I think in Texas we would say fish or cut bait. Now's the time to either, there's no excuses. Am I reading this wrong? Because that I just sort of made that up, but I'm not, frankly, completely following the line of thought that we've been on for the last 5 or 10 minutes.
Well, I'm sorry to have lost you a little. I
That's
think
all right. It's me.
um, it's not explicit in the text that like you can do whatever you want in Persia, but now we're here and you gotta follow the right laws. However, the way he's talking about the land and what you do in this land seems to have special connotation, right? And we know from the rest of the Tanakh that there are special laws that have to be observed in the land of Israel that don't have to be observed elsewhere. So the idea that, like, okay, we've got a second chance, God exiled us, and now we've got a second chance. We're coming back and we have to be perfect. We have to do everything right now that God has given us a second chance is very much there in the text. Yeah, thank you, Daniel. Sue.
Is the language a little bit trying to be a little bit reminiscent of when God, and maybe in Deuteronomy from this, where God says, oh, I'm taking you into the land from this, and it's got all of these terrible people in there, and I'm going to wipe them out from this, but they're back, but there's still some stuff that you need to do to make things right. It sounds very Deuteronomic, if that's a word.
Yes, so it's a similar ideology to Deuteronomy, and with that what we're playing with about who's responsible for actions in Deuteronomy is God's gonna do stuff and then we're going to do stuff, right? It's God's ultimately responsible and then we have actions to carry out. The language being used here specifically, actually though, is paraphrased from Leviticus. Ezra is very consciously using language you would have found in Leviticus. It's interesting because scholars used to say, okay, this is the point at which we know that Leviticus has to have been written for Ezra to be paraphrasing it, if you want to do dating biblical sources, but that's another topic. Anyway, yeah, so really quick, Sue, would you read us those last couple of verses, 13, 14, and 15?
And after all that has come upon us for our evil deeds and our great guilt, you, our Elohim, have refrained, punishing us less than our sin and giving us this survival. Should we return to break your commandments and to marry these people of abominations? Won't you become angry with us to the point of consumption, to the point where there is no remnant or survivor? God, Elohim of Israel, you are just, and we are left as a remnant like on this day. Here we are before you in our guilt, although it is impossible to stand before you on account of it. Wait a minute, don't we say this during the high holidays?
To place, yes. Great. Yeah, so Ezra finishes with this. He had been talking to people saying, just don't intermarry in verse 12. Verse 13 and 14, he expands the threat saying, because if you intermarry, God is going to exterminate us. If before God had killed most of us off and sent some of us into exile, if we continue to sin, to do bad in the land after we've been punished, surely the next punishment will be harsher. Surely the next time God punishes us, he might kill us completely. And then he finishes verse 15 with this line that Sue recognizes from High Holidays, Yefeh, about we are standing before you in guilt. We can't even stand before you. We are so guilty. Great. So I'm just going to sum up really quickly. This was a difficult text. I took you into a strange time period. But I want to end with the idea of responsibility in prayer, especially in community prayer. That often when we pray now, or even pre-Zoom times, when we're praying in a community, when you have Shaliach Sibor doing the praying, when we're a group of people praying together, using formulas, using words that sound familiar, words we know, words we say daily, there's a question, what are we trying to accomplish? Is God listening? Is the point of the prayer to influence God's behavior? Is it to influence our behavior? How does that work? And I think Ezra, one of the reasons Ezra 9 is so beautiful is because this is a guy who is a high priest. This is a Kohen Hagadol who is using prayer to influence his community, who's using prayer as a means of communicating with his community, as a means of saying, okay, this is our tradition. These are words that are meaningful to us. This is a God who has acted in certain ways before, but the outcome of my prayer is not me asking God to do something. There's no ask in this entire prayer for God to make any sort of action. Rather, the outcome of this prayer and what happens then in Ezra 10 is for the people to act, for the people to stop intermarrying, for the people to say, okay, we've done something wrong and we can change. So incredibly powerful, incredibly interesting thinking about what that is in our own prayer lives. I just want to close with this. So if that was Ezra 9, we have all the way back a month ago in Lamentations 2, we had prayer as we talked about it almost as a sort of therapy, as a communal complaint, prayer as reaching out to God and saying, how is it possible that this is happening? How could this happen? Let me verbalize what's going on in my life so that maybe you can stop it, maybe you can change it. This sort of reaching out to God so that God intervenes. And then we looked in Psalm 88 at the most depressing of all the Psalms of what it means to be calling out to God when you can't help yourself, when it's not an option to act, when you've got no recourse, you've got not even a person to turn to besides this heartfelt utterance to a God that can help. So we've looked at 3 types of prayer, very different types of prayer, and prayers that act in our lives in different ways. Anyone have any last final thought they want to say about any of that?
You needed a whole 4th class for us to all talk about how these 3 prayers. To answer that question is going to take more than a few minutes. Actually, no minutes.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
You're being invited back, at least I think.
And where else do you teach, and where else can we take classes with you?
Well, I'm honored you want to keep taking classes with me. I think Rabbi Ford and I are going to discuss what another course will look like for you guys. And I also am currently teaching in the Conservative Yeshiva summer program, which I mentioned to you guys too late to sign up, which I am ashamed and I'm embarrassed and I tear out my hair before you about it. Starting then later in July, in mid-July, I'll be teaching at noon on Tuesdays and Thursdays, the Book of Samuel, which I can email Rabbi Ford about and she can.
Yes.
Yeah.
Please
Whatever you're doing, and like Bex said, we're already thinking, like, everyone seems to really enjoy what you're doing, and we're talking about a second course, a second group of
And those of us who talk too much, promise not to talk too much.
No, don't stop talking too much. Not at all.
It's fun as a teacher when you're not just talking to yourself. I know it's true for me, and I'm pretty sure it's true for Bex too.
Needless to say, Bex, you've done a very, very, very good job. Thank you very
Yeah,
much.
I'm very impressed.
This was awesome. Thank you.
Yes, and we've been on Zoom nonstop since March 13th, and this was really wonderful, what you've given us.
Thank you. It's been really fun teaching you. And like, I mean, I'm grateful for those of you who haven't been talking, and I've appreciated looking at your names. For those who have talk though, thank you so much for contributing. This has been wonderful, and hopefully I will see you soon.
Okay.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, everybody.
All right. Bye-bye.
Toda rabba.
Power of the conservative yeshiva. I love it.
Yay.
It's the best. The crown jewel of our movement.